But then I think how you articulate strategy is incredibly important. And I think it's not just one line. It's also not a 500-page strategy deck. Like there has to be the right balance of being very clear about what are we trying to do? Why is that different from the business? Why is that going to help us achieve our vision? And then I think it can start including the conversation around what your objectives are and the kind of what are the key measures that you're going to use to know whether that strategy is headed in the right direction or not.
Welcome to a new episode of Product Directions Podcast, 100 Product Strategies. We are your insider access to top product leaders shaping the strategy of the most diverse industries today. I'm your host, Nacho Basino, and I'll be digging into the real-life situations, problems, and frameworks used for strategy with product people all around the world in all kinds of products and markets. While there is no recipe for success, listening to others' experiences may give you the edge you need to solve your next strategic challenge. Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm really glad to be with Martin Eriksson. Martin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Nacho. It's great to be here.
I assume many people will know who you are, but maybe for those who don't, or maybe just to give a quick update on what you have been doing lately, can you give us a brief intro?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Martin Eriksson. I've been in product for 25 years almost, building stuff online for even longer than that. 10 of those years as a product manager, kind of the last 15 years as a product leader and coach. I was the founder of Product Tank, co-founder of Mind the Product. I co-authored a book on product leadership published by O'Reilly in 2017. And then for the last 6 years, I've been a product partner at EQT, which is one of the world's 3 largest private investors. So we do everything from ventures to growth to kind of private equity. And my role is to support all of our portfolio companies on everything product strategy and org design and all those fun things. And through all that work, I've been working on this concept that I call the decision stack, which I'm assuming we'll be talking a bit more about today.
Absolutely, yeah. So that focus on product strategy is very helpful. You probably have many different perspectives and companies you work with that you can bring some examples. But yes, unsurprisingly, my focus, or at least the trigger of the conversation, will be around the decision stack. And maybe it will be interesting to have a quick overview. I will attach some links to the notes, but can you give us a brief description of what the decision stack is about? And I have an interesting question.
Yeah, of course.
Is there a origin story for the decision stack?
Yeah, so the origin story is kind of funny because I actually wrote it as a talk for, I think, the MTP Engage Hamburg leadership event in, I think, 2018 or 19. And to me, it kind of seemed obvious, but I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to do a talk. I knew I was doing it right after Marty Kagan, so I was a little nervous about it as well. And so I threw together this kind of thinking around strategy and alignment. And I think really the origin story is when we wrote the book, the main excuse for writing the book was to go out and interview product leaders from all over the world. So we interviewed nearly 100 product leaders about like what it means to be a product leader. What does that look like? What does great look like? And a lot of that conversation, a lot of the book ended up being about empowered teams, autonomous teams, and how you kind of set that up and the power of doing that. And in the book, I think we talk about alignment, but not a lot of people at the time were talking about what it takes to actually create that alignment. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of where the decision stack comes in, is that next step of, okay, hopefully we're working in empowered teams. And I know that's a contentious subject right now. But then if we have that, or if we're moving in that direction, how do we create the alignment that allows those teams to flourish and really have autonomy while still all running in kind of the same direction? And so that's kind of the where it came from. Mm-hmm. And the decision stack itself is really a mental model. I try to shy away from the word framework. I don't want it to be like a checkbox exercise that has to be followed slavishly or anything. And for me, it's at its simplest level, kind of looking from the top down, thinking about where are we going? How are we going to get there? How do we measure progress? And then what work do we actually need to do right now? And then how are we going to do that work? And from the bottom up, it's kind of the same conversation, but it's, okay, what am I working on today? Why is that important? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve? Why is that important? Where are we trying to head? And the reason I use those terms is I like to kind of be loose about it. I tend to then use vision, strategy, objectives, opportunities, and principles in the stack. But that doesn't mean that that's what everybody does. And there are teams using it today that don't want to use OKRs, and they don't want to use objectives and opportunities. So they use other terms in those places. But as long as you can connect the dots from the top to bottom and bottom to top, it's kind of doing what it needs to do.
Yeah, I love that, because if you Google it, you will see the graph, and the graph has very specific topics, but it's nice to have that framing in mind.
Yeah.
An interesting starting point. And I want to start with it at the top, because one of the things that I also noticed, and probably you have seen the same, is that many teams don't have a product vision, or have a vision statement that doesn't really help with the connection. What are the pitfalls you see in kind of starting with this alignment concept that you mentioned, when there's the lack of vision, or maybe some suggestion of what you can do about it?
Yeah, I think vision's incredibly important for me, and both at the company level and at the team level. And really, for me, it's thinking about what is unique to you in your business, and why is what you're doing important. And I think the best story I have there is actually Mind the Product itself, right? We had an early version of our mission was something like be the leading product community in the world. And that's, very typical of a lot of companies out there. We have these like cookie cutter things like to be the leading / best, product / service, kind of fill in the blanks. And there's your vision statement. And it kind of worked in the early days because we were a very small team. We were doing it on the side of our full-time jobs. We were all aligned, knew exactly what we were doing. But then as soon as we started hiring a team and we started hiring people, they kind of asked us, what does that actually mean? Like, what does leading mean? Why are we trying to be the leading? Like, these things aren't actually helping make decisions or helping with create that alignment. And so we sat down with the team and worked through that together. Like, what are we actually trying to do here? Why are we doing this? Why are we spending time and effort on this? And what we came up with was a new vision in about 2017, 18, that was to make product people more successful by coming together to further our crafts. And the reason that resonated for us as a team is that it opened up different opportunities, right? We're not talking about events. We're not talking about conferences. We're not talking about content or meetups. We're talking about who our customer is, which is product people, and our reason for being, which was to make them more successful. And the way that we thought we would do that is to bringing everyone together to talk about this craft. And the reason that's so powerful is evidenced a few years later when the pandemic hit and our event business kind of imploded, right? And we could go back to our vision and go, well, we're not talking about conferences. So if we can't do conferences for a couple of years, that's fine. There are other things that we can do in pursuit of this vision. And we could kind of readjust our strategy, readjust what we were doing without kind of letting go of that sense of mission and vision that we had as a team.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. What's interesting about this story is that kind of you have full decision power on what that vision is going to be. But you also mentioned kind of having this at a team level or company level. So do you have any, maybe with the companies you work with or the people you coach, what can someone do if they are not fully empowered to define this vision, but they still need it? What's the right step to get there?
I think that's the other part of the decision stack is it. And again, you mentioned that visual, and I need to figure out how to fit all this into one visual. But the other challenge with the decision stack is there's usually one at every level of your company, right? So there's probably one for the whole company. And if you're a really big organization, then you have one for every division, then you have one for every business line, then you have one, it's so on and so on. But even in a smaller, tech company or something like that, you probably have a company level one, and then you probably kind of have one at each level of the team. And again, there's no really easy, hard and fast rule of like, you must always have a vision, even for every team, or it must have a strategy. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't, but the stack kind of exists at different levels. And so my kind of standard response there to teams that don't feel like, well, I can't really affect the big company vision, I'm not in that conversation, I'm not at that table, is kind of just focus on what you do as a team. Like, what are you focused on? And even if it's a short-term thing, even if you are in a feature team, or even if you are focused on kind of a project, what are you trying to do with that team, and get your team around you? And like, why are we trying to do this? Who's our customer? What are we trying to do that's different from the rest of the competition, and kind of get a vision statement in place, even if it's kind of quick and dirty. I find it is incredibly motivating and helpful for teams. So my response would basically be just do it at your team level if you don't feel like you can affect the company one. Mm-hmm. And hopefully through that process, you can show that, well, this is working kind of well and it's got our team motivated. Maybe that enables us to open the door and have the conversation at the C-suite that this is really important and we don't feel like we have this at the company level. Maybe we should go through the same process there.
Yeah. And one interesting aspect of that is kind of going back to the initial framing you did, is that you don't need to have a fully fledged product vision, like a kind of Martin style with storyboard and all that. It's kind of what are we trying to achieve? It's more like kind of what you're trying to clarify.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
And who for, I think, right? I think that's the conversation we so seldomly have. So, and also sets you up better for strategic conversations when you really have a clear understanding of who your customer is and why you're doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, and basically, you stepped into one of the other questions I had in mind, which is kind of this nesting of sorts.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned this to you a couple of years ago. We actually faced it at Xing. We were using this mental model to clarify or to connect our artifacts, and we were getting into this point in which, okay, we have different divisions, and divisions are contributing to the company, and even the company has a parent company. So there was a lot of stages in there. You already mentioned that you have kind of one pair. But do you have any level in which you say, hey, this is more like company stage, this is division stage, this is team stage?
Yeah. I think this is going to be the first "it depends" of the interview, the kind of number one answer in everything in product. So I think I need to figure out how to articulate this better, but I don't think there is a hard and fast rule on that. I do think there's some level of uniqueness that then requires you to have a full stack, right? So you look at Sing, you had, or actually let's look at Google. It's a good example, right? So if you imagine Alphabet, the parent company, they kind of have a decision stack in place of like what their vision and strategy is. But then you look at Google, the search engine, versus YouTube versus Nest, that are all owned by Alphabet. They're completely distinct businesses. They have very different, strategies, products, everything. So it makes total sense that they again have a full stack. So they have their own vision, they have their own strategy. They all kind of tie into each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the vision for YouTube ties into the vision for Google, but it is distinct enough because it's such a distinct product. So that's the easy one, right? I think to your point, when you then get into the next level down, so you imagine like Google, they have a search team and then they have a Gmail team. Like, do they both need a vision? Do they both need a strategy? Definitely. Do they need a vision? Maybe not. And I think that's where it's a very gray area.
Yeah.
And really it's about whether, for me, it's about whether, again, those questions, right? So if you're asking from the bottom up, why are we doing this? If that kind of works, and then you can just skip a vision for Google search and go to the main Google vision, and that still works, then you might not need one. And the same on the way down, right? So how are we going to achieve this? Well, here's what we're going to do. If you don't need that intermediary step, then maybe you can skip it.
Yeah, good point. To add or to continue the Xing use case, what we had was, so Xing network has many different aspects, and we, for example, so jobs was a little phrase. We have a narrative for the vision, so it was a little phrase in the narrative. But then when we go to the shops division, we expanded on that same line, but making it a bit more richer to clarify more about what we're trying to do, because our strategy was more tied to a more concrete vision. So as you said, they're nested, and there can be different types of nesting, but this is kind of the angle we took to it.
Yeah. And again, I think that the how question from the top to the bottom and the why question from the bottom to top, I find is one of the most valuable parts of the whole stack. It's not almost the kind of pieces itself, because the how and the why show whether the piece is missing or whether you need more clarity in that piece. So I think that's where I argue for, again, if in Xing that kind of connected to the next one up, then you don't need one. If it doesn't, then maybe you want to clarify, like, actually, this is why we're doing this. So we have a slightly separate vision for this part of the company. And I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. So now that we explored this BU / company complexity, I want to go a bit deeper into strategy, because one of the challenges I usually find in strategy itself, not only with decision stack, but maybe the decision stack can help clarify it, is the right, what I call flight level, which is, okay, we have a strategy. At what level do we define it? It's kind of a concrete set of concrete opportunities. It's kind of this kind of high level goal. So there are many levels in between. So have you found any way to intertwine this? What's the correct granularity of the strategy to the decision stack?
I think it's it's a very good question. I think it's another one of the really big challenges, and I think here it's really dependent on the company stage, the product stage, what your funding situation is like, because all of those impact your strategic kind of time horizon as well. And so strategic arcs can be anything from, if you're a venture-backed startup, like I help out a lot, your strategic arc is probably only until your next funding round. So that might be 12 months away, versus, a big established company like Xing or Google. They probably have a 5-10 year strategy timeframe, and then, much tighter kind of cycles below that. And so there's always a little bit of kind of push and shove on that front, and a bit of it depends there as well, of what makes sense for the kind of stage of company and stage of products. And even there in a big organization, you might have, the well-established Google search, for example, could have a 5-10 year strategy horizon, but then they spin up a new product that might have a 6-month strategy horizon because they don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet. And so I think that's the biggest factor for me is, does this help you make decisions for what do you need to focus on? How are you going to resource that? What kind of team do you need? All those kind of things in the time frame that is applicable to you and your company. And then I think for me, the biggest piece of strategy is really making choices, right? So really starting to narrow down the choices of like, okay, we have a sense of what our vision is and where we want to go. What are we going to do in the next, time frame again? So 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, in order to go towards that vision. And that's where you start having to make tough choices of like which customers, which geographies, which, problems areas you're going to focus on. And for me, that's the really core conversation in strategy, because then we go to the next level and we talk, I think about objectives. I like OKRs. You don't have to use those, but thinking about objectives is like the next level of granularity down. Okay, so we're going to go after this geo. What do we actually have to get done in the next quarter to do that? Those kind of things, right? So it's really about breaking it down and starting to make choices. And I think that's where there's another visual, right, of the decision stack is kind of an inverted pyramid, because your vision still starts out quite wide, because your vision is kind of what you want to achieve in 30 years, or maybe not even in your lifetime. And so it can be a bit broader. It should be a bit bigger. It should be a big hairy ass goal, as we say. And then your strategy is kind of, well, what are we doing in the next couple of years in order to get closer to that vision? Yeah. And then your objectives are the next step down, and so on. And so it's really about starting to make choices that narrow down the options in front of you, so that as your teams get to, hopefully that, again, empowered team picks up an objective and wants to figure out what are we going to build towards it, they've already got some fairly clear choices in front of them of, this is the customer group we're going after, this is the problem set we're trying to solve. And within that, still have a lot of creativity and a lot of freedom to figure out what is the best and most impactful thing to build, but still in that general direction that the whole company is going after.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel I'm going back a bit into the previous questions or the previous discussion we were having, but you mentioned something that's quite interesting, is this relationship between what you can call the company strategy and the product strategy, which again, I'm coming to the decision stack from the product perspective, but I guess that the same can apply to a company, to company goals or company strategies and whatnot. But in that same direction, how do you feel this differentiation from the decisions that are in the product strategy versus the company strategy? Because, for example, what I'm trying to say is that maybe a segment or geography is more of a company decision than a product decision, especially if the company is bigger. So do you see, how do those play together?
Yeah, first of all, they're incredibly tightly intertwined, right? So I think if you are the third, it depends of the interview. I think if you are a small startup and you maybe only have one product, your company strategy probably is basically your product strategy. I think the other distinction I tend to have is if your business is, makes its money by building the product. So if you're a SaaS business, for example, then your product strategy and company strategy are very much intertwined, versus is your technology there to enable the thing you sell. So if you're an e-commerce company or something like that, your technology isn't directly the thing that builds company value. It enables the thing that builds value. Mm-hmm. And so that's where you start having more of a distinction. So again, there's so many different dimensions here, but I think to think about it almost from the other way of like, you cannot create a product strategy without having a clear business strategy. And that's one of the biggest problems I see when I go into companies, big and small, is I tend to get pulled in, because I'm the product guy. I tend to get pulled into having those conversations about, oh, we can't quite figure out a roadmap, or we're having a hard time prioritizing our roadmap, or we have too many choices. I also get called in when boards every once in a while are kind of asking the question of, we don't know if our development teams and product teams are being efficient. Can you come have a look? And almost all the time, those questions boil down to the companies are trying to do too many things at one time. And that's because there isn't a clear company strategy, and therefore it's impossible to set a product strategy. So even if they're very closely intertwined or almost exactly the same thing, the reason I'd like to think about the decision stack as not just a product tool is you have to imagine that once we have a vision and a company strategy, even if you are that small startup that's a SaaS business where it's basically the same thing, you also have a marketing team, and you also have a sales team, and you also have a customer service team, customer success team, all those kind of things that also have to take that company strategy and figure out, well, what does that mean for us? And so if that company strategy level isn't there, and if it isn't creating alignment for everybody in the organization, then of course, like, product's going to go run off, do its own thing, and sales is going to go enterprise, while product goes for product-led growth bottoms up, like that's where chaos lies. So if nothing else, I hope that product leaders, especially, because product managers, designers, engineers, we are all amazing kind of problem solvers, and fundamentally that's what strategy is, can kind of apply those principles to have that conversation at the company level. And really what I want the decision stack to do is to empower everybody, whether you're a product leader, design leader, a sales leader, or marketing leader, to kind of have that conversation about strategy and get everyone aligned. Because the whole point of making those choices about strategy, geography, strategy, how are we going to compete with the customer, how are we going to solve the customer problem better, is that it impacts everything, right? It impacts how we sell, it impacts how we market, and impacts how we talk about the company, and it impacts what we actually have to build. And so if we're not elevating that conversation and we're not having that conversation, then our lives as product people is infinitely harder, because we end up with those like, well, let's just do everything, right? And we don't actually make any tough choices even for the product strategy.
One tough question related to that, especially from a diagramming it perspective. Actually, if you're thinking about the product strategy, and if you have a business strategy which is saying, hey, we will expand to distribution, I will argue that the product strategy is the how to that business strategy. How do we expand into distribution? These are the things we need to build in the product. But it also at the same time answers the how to the product vision, because also kind of there are these two angles intertwined into it. And the same for the why. So if we ask, going back to your example, if we as product want to go the product-led growth route, we want to answer why we are doing that, and that why should match to some company or business strategy.
Yeah. And this is the problem, right? Because trying to map, and this is the problem with anything that we try to map in product, trying to map an n-dimensional kind of challenging space onto a two-dimensional diagram on a slide or a piece of paper is really hard. So, which is why, again, I really like emphasizing thinking about this as a mental model and focusing on those how and why questions, and not exactly the shape of the blocks that go into it. I mean, the other visual I have in my head for the team side thing is like, well, if you think about a cube almost, right? Because you could have product on one side of the cube, and then you could turn the cube over and you have sales, and they all still have to connect to the same top layer. But that just gets really complicated on a slide or in a blog post. So it's really hard to visualize, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, what I like about what we discuss is kind of this not having product running towards only answering the how to their product vision, but thinking about the business side of things, or the n-dimensional things.
Yeah. And I see that so often, right? Because I'm sure you do as well when you go in and talk to companies, right? And you've been writing some great content recently about OKR trees and things like these are all related to that same challenge of if we're not focused on the same things, then parts of our organization, either don't know what we're doing, and then that breeds the mistrust and all the challenges that we have about communicating roadmaps and prioritization. Or even worse, it means that sales is, building an enterprise sales team with kind of customer calls and like big events and things like that, and we're trying to build a bottoms up product-led growth motion, and those two things don't necessarily match up perfectly. And so the company is going to struggle to hit its goals because the product organization is doing one thing and sales is doing a different thing. So I think the most important thing that we can do is to elevate the conversation and make sure that strategy is clear for the whole organization, almost even before we sit down and try to figure out what the product version is.
Okay, then switching gears a bit, I have more practical questions to ask about the decision stack.
Yeah.
The first one is around goals. You put clear goals of the strategy. I imagine that thinking about, okay, we have shorter term ways to understand if we are going in the right direction, but also one can argue that strategy is an answer to how we achieve these higher level goals. How do we increase our revenues, reduce our churn, or whatever through this strategy or through this concept. So will you put that in the strategy itself, or how do you frame it?
Yeah, I think strategy is a tricky one in terms of like what it looks like, right? I think there's a couple of thoughts there. So first of all, I think the most valuable part of strategy work is not actually the slide deck or the document at the end of it. It's actually the work that you do, hopefully as a whole team, to look at your market, look at your business, look at your customer problem, look at all the opportunities that you have in front of you, figure out like what is the strategic differentiation point that you have. Like that whole conversation is more valuable than the kind of document at the end of it. But then I think how you articulate strategy is incredibly important. And I think it's not just one line. It's also not a 500-page strategy deck. Like there has to be the right balance of being very clear about what are we trying to do, why is that different from the business, why is that going to help us achieve our vision. And then I think it can start including the conversation around what your objectives are and kind of what are the key measures that you're going to use to know whether that strategy is headed in the right direction or not. You can also include insights or data that you have about why you've made those choices. That's always helpful, especially if you imagine that new joiner that joins a team a week after you've had your strategy workshop. They can't be in that conversation. They still have to kind of consume that content and be part of that conversation. So you can definitely flesh it out more and have more color of like why you've made those choices, why we think this is important, how we're going to measure as we go, whether we're heading in the right direction or not. I think the other challenge with strategy is that it is just like hypothesis that we do in product. It's an intuitive leap, right? So we still will never have perfect information, no matter how much research you do, no matter how much data you look at. You're still making a bet at some point. You're still having a hypothesis. And so unpacking what the hypothesis is, unpacking what the assumptions that went into it, as much of that validation as you've been able to do of why you have confidence that this is a good bet, I think is important to articulate as part of that strategy. Because I think that then sets you up for much clearer goals, objectives, and a kind of level down, and keeps everyone on the same page and keeps everyone honest about, no, we're still working on the same thing. And this new idea that came up over here is not going to impact that number. So it's not as important. It's not really going to help us do the strategy.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned, the strategy is answering a question that is also related to your situation at the company, the level of funding. For example, if you're saying, hey, I need to fix churn because I will not make it to the next round, then it's something that will of course, be a mandate for the strategy versus, okay, we are doing good. We're just trying to find the next differentiation to keep growing. And that's a completely different exercise from the previous one. Even nowadays, I can even go back to solution. Maybe solution dictates strategy. Nowadays, everyone is doing AI, because if you don't do AI, you will not get the next round of investment. So,
and that's where it can get really weird, right? And especially in the venture side of the business that I help coach on, you have some very strange conversations because that's not necessarily you're not hitting a key metric, you're not necessarily looking at growth. Sometimes you don't even want to start monetizing until after the next round, because it'd be worse to start monetizing and have low numbers than to show other success metrics and then we'll monetize in the next. So it can get really weird in startup land because you really do have to focus on what do we need to do to get to the next point. And what are the proof points that we can show? And sometimes that is, pure metrics, sometimes it's revenue and things like that. But sometimes it can be, no, actually, we just have to show that we can build an AI feature. Although that's not always the answer. I think it's definitely the hot word right now, obviously. But I think investors are getting savvy enough to see through if you've just plastered it onto your product. But yeah, I think at the startup level, strategy sometimes is very much about what are we going to communicate in order to get the next round, because that's kind of the train that you're on. And I'm not saying that's right for everyone. As a VC, I will always be the first person to say the VC journey is not right for every business. There's nothing wrong with building a business without VC money. But when you are on that journey, you're trying to build a really global, huge business and accelerate that through VC funding. That's the journey that you're on. And so you get into slightly strange conversations sometimes. But that's strategy still, right? That's a conversation about what choices are we making? What can we do with the capabilities that we have? How are we going to stand out in the marketplace? How are we going to wow those customers, but also how are we going to wow those investors in a year when we sit down around the table and need the next check, right?
I think, first of all, I will challenge you that I have seen some of those conversations in bigger enterprises, especially in public companies that have press releases and during the quarter review cycle. So there is some of that going
on. Yeah.
But the second thing I think is most important to the conversation is that product leaders are sometimes oblivious or even kind of fighting back to those conversations, which in reality is part of business. So it's part of your role, especially if you're the higher up you're in the chain. It's understanding those needs and knowing that you're not there only to serve the user. You have to serve multiple constituents.
Absolutely. And if you're a public company, then you have a whole quarterly shareholder cadence to add to your nightmares, right? About how we communicating that and how we building a good momentum and stories there. And sometimes that metric, sometimes that is slapping an AI feature on there, and it's not right, but it's the reality that we live in, right? And we have any product role lives in a world with multiple constituents. We should care most about our customer, hopefully, but we also have to care about everyone else.
Yeah, so going back to what you're saying, it's kind of the putting the strategy, the right mix of things depending on the situation you're in.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing there is to, again, remember that strategy is not set in stone, right? So even if you're in one of those more established companies and it is a 3 to 5 year strategy, if you learn something that invalidates that strategy, then you should throw it out and think again, right? I think that should be the most empowering thing for product leaders, design leaders, engineering leaders out there, that if they see something not working, if the strategy is not clear, it's not working, have seen some piece of evidence or research that shows that they have a better idea, they should be able to challenge that, right? They should be able to go up to the CEO or the C-suite and say, this strategy isn't working. Here's why. Here's the evidence. Can we have another conversation about what we should be doing instead?
Yeah. Okay, we went down that route and objectives and what comes first. One more practical thing that I also want to pick your brain on is roadmaps. You purposely didn't include that controversial topic. So what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I have a hot take in that I think in some sense roadmaps should kind of die, but I haven't quite figured out what we should replace them just yet. I think if you do have roadmaps, and roadmaps can be incredibly important in terms of communicating your priorities, especially as a product team. For me, though, they're not necessarily a strategic conversation, so that's why I don't kind of have them in the stack. Because for me, a roadmap would really be, it's the prioritized list of the opportunities in front of you, right? So the objects that you put on the roadmap are in the stack, but I think the roadmap itself, in my view, doesn't live in the stack. But again, this is where it's a mental model. It's not a framework. So if it helps people to have that clarity of like, okay, let's have an objectives, then let's have a step for roadmaps, then have the opportunities that go on that roadmap under that. That makes total sense. It still fits in that mental model of the how and why questions. So I think if that helps people bring that clarity to their team, that's great. For me, it's more about almost cutting that conversation out, because I think there's so many downsides to roadmaps around setting expectations. People think that's set in stone. They think a priority is communicated. We've had the debate about dates for 10 years. All those challenges that come with a roadmap. As soon as we produce a roadmap, people kind of think it's set in stone and it's a promise, and it's not, no matter how much we caveat it. So I kind of like to almost take that conversation off the table and just talk about, here's the objectives, here's a number of opportunities, maybe loosely prioritized, but not kind of in a traditional roadmap format, just to kind of confound those expectations.
Okay, got it. Maybe going in the direction of how we replace it. One of the things that usually happens is that in strategies you need to organize big blocks. For example, we need to fix churn before going into more acquisition. So if that's not part of the roadmap, where do you see that conversation?
So that's definitely something I don't want at the roadmap level, because I think that becomes too tempting then for leadership to kind of get into the details and be arguing about, feature A versus feature B, or we should do, ship this bug over this feature, and kind of breaks down the empowerment of our teams. And so where I want that conversation to be is really about how big is this problem. So say we're talking about churn at the kind of strategic or objective level. How big a problem is this? How much do we want to invest in that area, whether it's resources or time? And, I work with everything from startups where it can be like, well, we have 2 teams, so we can't do 10 different things anyway. How are we going to prioritize where we're going to say, let's, churn's a problem. We're going to have this team focus on it for 3 months, and then we'll see where we're at and we'll readjust. And then it's still up to the team to figure out exactly what the features or bugs or whatever they want to build to fix that problem is, without getting into kind of a roadmap level detailed conversation at the management level. And I think that's a much more empowering way to build this, and it keeps everyone focused on kind of the right height in the stack for where their level is. And that's still true in much bigger organizations, right? So even if you have, 2 teams only working on churn, and 2 teams only working on conversion, and 2 teams only working on, other parts of your product, etc., you can still decide that actually churn's such a big problem now, we're going to make it 3 teams, or we're going to like bring in more people into that, or we're going to put our like strongest team on that, and we're going to readjust some. So like I want that conversation to be at a much higher level about resources, and again, it's kind of bets and hypothesis, and how much do we want to invest in this area, as opposed to do we think feature X, or do we do 5 churn features and then we move to the 6th one, or like that kind of level of conversation, I think is where we get really muddy and really dangerous for the empowerment of our teams.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, to be honest, when I was thinking about roadmaps, I was thinking about kind of the outcome-based roadmaps, or how Chef Kotel, for example, explained it, and then it kind of goes in the same direction.
No, absolutely. I mean, again, roadmaps can be an incredibly important tool. So I like to be slightly controversial about getting rid of them, but I think if they are still have a place, they're still important. But if you are doing them, they should be that kind of thematic, outcome-focused roadmap. And obviously, with that now, next, later format that Jenna Bastow kind of championed of having less and less detail the further out you're looking and things like that. But I still think it's worth trying to think about how can you do that differently and kind of zoom out a level so that the conversation's a little more high level than down to the feature level.
Yeah. And the way you frame it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the key things that if you eliminate roadmaps, you need to replace is this kind of resource allocation, how much we want to invest in this part or not. And the way you describe it is a good way to jump over it. Then I'm switching gears, but I want to touch on one that we didn't mention in the introduction, which is principles, that you kind of put them at the bottom. One way I constantly feel myself going into when, especially with the teams that have these principles, is that they inform multiple layers of the decision stack. So maybe it was a visualization decision, or it was more like how do you combine those two?
It's another one of those visualization challenges for sure. You could argue that principles come next to right after strategy or at the bottom kind of thing, but for me it comes back to that mental model about being able to ask the how and why question. And so when you think about asking how, as you're looking at a piece of work, like, okay, we are going to build this feature. The team's agreed, like, this is what we're going to build. How are we going to build it? Is the the principles are there to support that. So you can put it anywhere in the stack in many ways. I like it at the bottom for that reason, but it's a visualization challenge again. And I think to your point, it very much reflects your strategy. So they are the two things that I see missing most often in organizations. But they're also the two pieces that kind of reflect each other and therefore help keep teams more aligned, keep teams thinking more strategically, but also keep them focused on that strategy.
Yeah. Interesting what you said, because I will normally think about it from a decision perspective about strategy or kind of informing a strategy. Why? Because typical random example, if you say we are a marketplace and we value customers over sellers, then that can inform your strategy in a way. But as I was saying, probably informs any decision you can make. Do you see it otherwise, kind of reflecting the strategy?
I think it's semantics at this point, right? So I think you could definitely have it before strategy. I think they very much reflect each other, and especially that marketplace example, I think is one of the easiest ways to talk about principles anyway, is any kind of two-sided product, right? I learned this lesson very early on when I worked at Monster, the job board, where we struggled with these decisions in the early days of like every single feature we looked at could be built job seeker friendly or recruiter friendly, and we had the debates every single time. Until I, pulled the CEO into the room one day, CEO and founder into the room. And he's like, hang on, job seekers always come first, because if we build an amazing experience for them, recruiters have to follow. And that became a principle for us and just suddenly make it all those decisions easier. So you could argue that that's a reflection of the strategy, that like we've made a choice to like be job seeker focused, therefore that principle reflects that. You could also argue that was a principle and then the strategy shapes before that. So there's a little chicken and egg challenge here, I think. And then the flip side of that is you look at Shopify. I think they've done the opposite. It's not to say it's always the consumer side is the most important. So Shopify has said that merchants come first because they believe that by building the best possible merchant experience, they get the best possible, shops and interesting store owners on their platform. And that way they get the most customers. So it's not about, there's no right or wrong. It's just, it's making a choice and having that clear choice. So you could absolutely see how you're saying that it could sit before strategy. It's just the way I like to think about it. It comes after that strategic decision that is what we're focused on. And that's how we're going to differentiate ourselves to our customers. And therefore you can articulate that as a principle to make it really, really clear.
Yeah, makes sense. I think I'll do that.
But I also think the reason I think about a little later is because I think principles, I think that high level one makes a ton of sense to sit, very close. And whether, again, it could be before strategy. I totally take your point. It could come after strategy. But I think there's other principles that we want to get really clear about trade-offs, right? So whether there's, it's not just the customer focused on, like maybe in the short term, we're focused on conversion over revenue, or in the current market, probably the other way around, we're focused on revenue over conversion. But But those are kind of more strategic conversations. So you kind of have to make that as a strategic bet, and then you can articulate it as a principle that helps people make decisions. So maybe that's why I have it towards the end, because I think some of those really big ones are very much hand in hand in strategy. But then I think there's also lots of little ones that we might use as our product teams. And again, where they might be different from product team to product team. Because again, even at Monster, there was obviously a recruiter product team, and they would build things in a recruiter friendly way because that was made sense for their customer. And so maybe that's why I think about it as kind of more supporting the work that we do, and coming after the strategic decisions.
Yeah, makes sense. By the way, you mentioned that not many product teams have principles. Do you see a reason for that? So...
I think it's just a different way to think about it. So I think a lot of product teams and a lot of companies out there have values, and they talk about values, and sometimes some of those values touch on these kind of things, but a lot of times the values are, the more fluffy statements like build a delightful user experience. And there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, we all want to build delightful user experiences. But I think the problem with it is it doesn't really help you make a decision, right? Because no one's coming into a weekly stand-up with an idea to like build a shitty user experience, and then you have to go, no, that we have a value on the wall over there. We should only build good ones. So it's not helping you make decisions. It's nothing wrong having that conversation. I think values can be really important, and there's obviously more clear values about inclusivity and other things that you should really have conversations about, so everyone's on the same page. I think those are really important. But I think then really articulating principles helps you make decisions, more decisions faster and better. And I think that if that's why they're such an important part of the stack, that they really connect in with your strategy and your objectives. And that's the distinction for me, is it's really there to help you make a decision.
Makes sense. All right. Now, no more nitty-gritty questions about decision stack. Maybe the broader question I usually end up with: what's some learning about strategy you had in your career that we didn't cover and you think is important to share with leaders?
Yeah, first of all, I think I'm still learning. So hopefully everyone out there who's looking at strategy is, not doesn't have a set mind and has an open mind. I think there's so many different ways to look at strategy. There's so much scholarly material. I got super excited the other day. I discovered a book that Christina Watke actually recommended to me called The Strategy Safari, which is written by Henry Mintzberg and a few others. And it's really focusing on like looking at all the strategy methodologies out there. It turns out it's a bit more of an academic book, so it's kind of trying to group them into schools and schools of thought and things like that. And it's still incredibly valuable because it really helps you think about them. It's still not solving the problem of like there's one strategy. So maybe that answer isn't out there. So I think the first thing is just to always keep learning and always have an open mind to think about these things. And I think the big thing that I'm learning as I'm going through this process of trying to think more about the decision stack, potentially write a book, is really that there's no one right way to do this, but there are some clear, first principles that, especially again, product managers, designers, engineers, we all have a superpower in, which is, what problem are we trying to solve here? Who's our customer? Where do we want to go? And how do we get from where we are today to there, right? That's really what strategy is. And I think we have some unique superpowers to do that. We're also out, hopefully, again, if we're talking about modern cross-functional teams doing a lot of discovery, we're the ones out talking to customers. We have a lot of firsthand insight. We're looking at data, and we have a lot of evidence that we can bring to bear to have that strategic conversation. So really, I think, again, just really hope that this is all very empowering to even individual product managers, designers, and engineers to kind of feel that they can have that strategic conversation. They can challenge strategy. They can challenge those principles and really have that conversation. That's kind of what I hope comes out of all this work.
Perfect. Yeah. So being conscious about the power you have to shape the strategy. I love it. Yeah. This has been wonderful. Thanks for sharing all this wisdom with us. Where can people find you? What they can do for you?
I think for now, mostly I'm writing about this stuff on the decisionstack.com. You can sign up there for free to get the latest kind of slides and email updates whenever I do add content. And hopefully in time, as I said, there will be a book coming out of this, but it's probably next year. And in the meantime, I want to hear kind of how people are using it, what's working, what's not working. How can I reflect that better? Because I think, again, I want this to be an open mental model that people use in different ways, and they use different tools in that model. And so I want to be able to reflect that back. So all feedback is welcome. If anyone wants to write about how they're using it or how it hasn't worked for them and have that up on the site in their name, I'm open to that as well. So I just hope it's a good conversation about how we can all be better at doing these things.
That sounds super cool. Yeah. So doors open for feedback. Thanks again, Martin, for all the wisdom you shared today.
Thanks for having me. Always a great time to chat, and keep up the great work on the podcast.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of 100 Product Strategies, the podcast by Product Direction. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram to get access to free weekly content that helps product people upgrade their skills and become more successful. You can access more material, promotional trainings, and be notified of every episode of the show with Product Direction's weekly newsletter. Join thousands of product leaders by registering in productdirection.co.